You might have noticed that I, in all my earlier videos, kind of have stayed out of the industrialized era. That's because all that comes with that is so complex, and it's not that easy to know where to start, actually. But this week I thought I'll start biting into it. Hello! I know I haven't finished talking about the pre-industrialized housewife yet, but there are some things I want to film to include to what's coming next in that one, so I'll just leave her for a while and then we'll come back to her later on. So, industrialization, where to start? Let's start with the basics. And I know that many of you know all this in school, but I feel that it's so essential that I just have to include it. There are some interesting videos showing how all these machinery that were invented during this era were operated. And I'll put links to these videos. I'll put them in the description box and I'll put them around here somewhere as well. It's easy to get the picture that industrialization was something that happened over quite a short period of time. After all, we are talking about it as a revolution. And revolutions tend to take something from a few months to perhaps 5 years. This, of course, wasn't the case here. It took the best parts of, well, perhaps 250 years before most of the Western world were industrialized. But how it changed people's lives truly were revolutionary. As I've often said in my earlier videos, before the industrialization, most people were farmers. By the year 1700, development have been more or less the same throughout Europe and America, as well as most of the world, actually. The different societies weren't very different at all. They were all based on agriculture, and every now and then there came a small invention that made life a little easier than earlier. The spinning wheel, for instance, must have been a big difference for women, since it's so much faster to use than spinning with a spindle. But roughly we can say that life in the 1200s were quite similar to life in the early 1700s. It was the textile industry that led the way in the development towards an industrialized society. In Britain, where the Industrial Revolution started, they already had a quite extensive textile industry. But before all these new machines were invented, it was mostly managed by a putting out system. Merchants took the raw materials to people's homes, where they, for a fee, would produce the textiles for the merchant to sell. And often it was different people spinning the yarn and weaving the fabric. There were quite a few problems with this system, but one of the biggest was that the spinners really couldn't keep up with the weavers. And that imbalance got even worse once the first mechanized loom, the Flying Shuttle, was invented in 1733. Obviously something needed to be done about this, but even though some improvements were made on the weaving side of it all, it wasn't until 1764 the spinning jenny, the first spinning machine, were invented. With the spinning jenny, it was possible to spin up to 16 threads at a time, with the same amount of work that it earlier took to spin just one thread. Both weaving machines and spinning machines frequently were improved on, and in just a couple of decades they could spin hundreds of threads at the same time and weave even faster. Both the spinning jenny and the flying shuttle still depended on muscle power to be operated. This was the next step in the development. They needed a new power source. The first and perhaps most obvious solution to this was water power. Water mills have been used for centuries to power flour mills, or grid mills that they were actually called, and forges and so on. But now they could connect it to all this new machinery that the industrialization brought with it. There was one problem with this though. To ensure and control the needed stream of water, the factory owners had dams built. And in areas where there were a lot of these new industries, they kind of started fighting over the water. One factory opening their dams for their production could leave another factory completely dry. So it seemed that water power wasn't really enough for the development to continue. And here enters the true star of the Industrial Revolution. The one that was so modern in its production of power that we still kind of depend on it for more or less everything we do today. This is, of course, the steam engine. The harvesting of the energy that lies within steam was not at all a new thought. Even ancient philosophers pondered upon this, and the earliest description of it is about 2,000 years old. The earliest patents on steam engines were taken in the 1600s, but it wasn't until the second part of the 1700s they got effective enough and practically shaped so they could be used in any line of production. With a steam engine, factories could move anywhere, and it wasn't unusual that they moved to where they could find the cheapest labourers. Is this something perhaps we recognise today? Why it all started in Britain is something that historians still are debating. And here we come into the complexity of causality. The reason for something happening rarely is one single event, but thousands of little things that have to click for the next step to be taken. One reason for Britain's leading part in this development, and it seems like the historians are mostly agreeing on this, was that the steam engine needed fuel, and if there was something the Britons had, it was coal. They had easy access to it, and there were a lot of it. With the industrialization, people entered a completely new kind of life. In all earlier times, nature had dictated the rhythm of life. People slept when it was dark, harvested in the autumn, and slowed everything down in winter times. But in the industrialized world, they started living their lives after the clock. Often the factories were in constant production, and the workers, well, they had to work in shifts. The Industrial Revolution also brought about a consumer and advertising revolution. Before, an item didn't exist until someone saw that they needed it and then made it. But in the industrialized world, the factory first produces the item and then works on convincing you that you need it. All this new production and consumption needed new inventions to support them. Most of all, the goods needed to be transported. To start with, in Britain there were an extensive system of canals built, dug out by hand. And eventually, of course, along came the railway. In most history books, they mark the end of the Industrial Revolution at about the 1840s. But I find this a bit problematic, actually. The industrialization of the society continued for at least 100 years after that. And that remaining 100 years is at times called the Second Industrial Revolution. But many countries, including Sweden, didn't start their industrialization until, well, around the 1850s perhaps. So for them, of course, there were just one industrial revolution. Even if this development never slowed down, I guess that people kind of got used to it, and that the revolutionary feel about this kind of transformed to an evolutionary feel. Development and progress had become a part of people's everyday life. I hope you learned something new today. See you soon, I hope. Bye!